Welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'm Andrew Schwartz, and it is my pleasure to host this really terrific book event. It's truly a unique event, and I want to thank one of our advisory board members, Lori Bertman, who's on the CSIS advisory board, and she's also the CEO of the Pennington Foundation in Louisiana, who has helped make this possible. I want to thank the Davies family who allowed us to do this. When I heard about this fascinating book, I just couldn't, help myself but to ask my good friend John Davies if we could do something about his dad. And I'm just delighted that all of you are here, and I'm delighted that we have this just stellar panel here tonight. And with that, before we get to the panel and David Sanger is going to kick things up, I'd like to invite up John P. Davies' daughter, Tiki Davies, who's going to give some opening remarks. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Tiki Davies. Bring that down. I'm getting instructions from the left. I'm one of John Paton Davies Jr.'s 7 children, and I and my brother Johnny have to thank Andrew and Laurie for this event tonight. I also want to thank Michael Kaiser, the president of the Kennedy Center, who in his impossibly busy schedule managed to proof the book 3 times. My father started writing this book in the early 70s at the request of Viking Press. Some 20 years later, still not finished, he had slowed to a stop, reluctant to write about the unpleasantness of his last years in the Foreign Service. He was not somebody who spent time looking back or mourning the past. When he died in 1999, the family wanted the book published, and I took on the task a couple of years ago. I was lucky enough to find Bill Finan, who's here today, from Penn Press, and Todd, who wrote the introduction, and Bruce Cummings from the University of Chicago, who wrote the epilogue. Our father was clear-sighted, unsentimental, amazingly prescient in his take on world events, loyal, loving, and very funny. One last thing, because he's not here today to sign any books, we found his Chinese chop, the representation of his name in Chinese characters. And we have it here so that anyone who wants their book, it can be stamped in the traditional red ink. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And with that, I'll give it to my great friend, David Sanger.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to the Davies family for bringing this book out. I've had the great pleasure of reading, I think, just about all of it now, and the wonderful intro by Todd. And it's a great read. I mean, what Tiki did not mention was he's a fabulous writer. And some of the scenes, and I'm going to read you one in a moment, are just absolutely precious, and in some cases very funny. I have the great pleasure tonight of something that almost never happens in Washington, which is actually getting to moderate a panel of some of my greatest friends. So it's great to be here with all of them. In Washington, people always say introduce somebody as a friend, but these actually are friends. So. Steve Clements, to my left, is the editor-at-large at The Atlantic. You probably read his blog fairly often. He was the founder of the American Strategy Program at the New America Foundation, and he is everywhere on every subject here. Michael Green, who's over at the end, holds the Japan chair here at CSIS. He's an associate professor of international relations at Georgetown. He was in the National Security Council during the Bush administration. He had the pleasure then of going out and spinning me at great length, and he was one of those few people you enjoyed the process of coming in and being spun, because you always discovered that he actually had something interesting to say, which doesn't always happen in Washington when you go out to that. And then my dear friend Todd, who is the national editor at Vanity Fair. For 23 years before that, he was my colleague at the Times. We started the same?
Within weeks of each other.
Within weeks of each other. We were copy boys together. We have great stories from that period.
He was already ahead of me even then. But
We have great stories, almost none of which can be told with cameras running, but they're good. Todd was correspondent in the Washington Bureau, and we were very sad to give him up to the happier life at Vanity Fair. And he was, of course, the Los Angeles bureau chief, which was a great job because I knew when I landed in Los Angeles and I showed up at his house, you never know who from Hollywood was going to be actually wandering in the door that day. So, with that, the book, we'll spend a lot of time, obviously, discussing the political environment and what happened to John Paton Davies, Jr. But one of the great scenes in the book comes with a plane crash that he was in with Eric Sevareid, of all people, as they are flying into China from Burma, I think, right? And so all but one person survives the crash. They parachute out of this plane. They're not entirely sure where they are, and they end up into the welcoming hands of a tribe of headhunters. But it turns out that the tribe of headhunters, I guess, weren't hungry that night or whatever, but they turn out to be relatively friendly. He deals with them quite diplomatically, as you would expect. Ultimately, they come together and find Sevareid and most of the rest of their party, who had already been airdropped a little bit of food and a note saying, "We're sending a rescue party." Well, the rescue party was walking in, so it took 12 days, and was led by a British diplomat. And I just have to read you this part because when I said this was well written, I meant it. "From out of the jungle's green obscurity, there strolled into our meadow a young Englishman, blonde, hatless, pale blue polo shirt open at the throat, dark blue flannel shorts, stockings to the knee, and heavy brogues." And people just don't dress like that anymore, okay? "He was unarmed, carrying only a slim bamboo stick and a black Dunhill cigarette holder. This was Philip Adams, and he had come 12 days through the mountain jungles to rescue us. He knew how to do so, for he was a civil administrator in the hill country on the Indian-Burmese border and wise in the way of the Nagas." That was the tribe that was there. So with Adams was this task force of some 60 Naga scouts who, fortunately, he said, were wearing khaki shorts instead of G-strings. So you would think that when this British diplomat shows up and he finally discovers the poor people who had to parachute out of this plane, he would be enormously concerned about their welfare. He would tell them how quickly he would get them out of there. No, in the finest traditions of the British civil service, he has his team set up his own private dining table, separate and apart, of course, from the rescue, right? From a jug of rum, his manservant made him a before-dinner drink. The servant placed a folding table in front of the Basha and set it with white linen and silver. We will never have these great days of diplomacy again. And it goes on in this line. So, even if you don't care about the politics of China at this most fascinating time, and it is fascinating, read it for the plane crash story. It's worth it. Okay, so let me start with you, Todd. You wrote this really interesting introduction that explains this moment of madness in American foreign policy, where this man who had won the Medal of Freedom and who was considered the great rising star of the State Department suddenly gets accused for having written realistic cables back to Washington that basically said, if you think Mao isn't winning this one, think again, kids, because you've got it wrong. And he is strung up for this by McCarthy. Tell us a little bit about that era and how it looked now as you went back and read this, because you said you had first run across Davies' stuff in 1979.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you start with the plane crash, because that's really how I came to be aware of who John Paton Davies was, because I was an undergraduate at Princeton, and Eric Sevareid's memoir, which he wrote just after the war, called Not So Wild a Dream, had then been recently republished. And I came across a copy of it, and I just thought this was the most amazing story in the world. I mean, it was worthy of Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, what they went through. And when Davies was on the plane, he was carrying a special bottle of dark brown ink for Madame Sun Yat-sen, and a bottle of rare cognac, because that's the kind of person he was. He was, you know, really in the upper reaches of contact with Chinese society.
Because as the plane is losing altitude, they take all the hand luggage and throw it out the back of the plane.
Including his briefcase, which surfaces totally pristine a short time later. They find it and they bring it back to him. But he just had an unbelievably American life. He was born in the last months of Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, and he died in the aftermath of Bill Clinton's acquittal on impeachment charges. And in between, he brushed up against or worked with a completely dizzying array of the most interesting figures of the 20th century, from FDR to Stalin, George Kennan, Lord Mountbatten, even Noel Coward and Frank Capra. And in the middle of World War II, Wild Bill Donovan, the head of the OSS, he ran into him, I think in Washington at this point, or maybe someplace abroad, and Donovan told him that he was quite sure that J. Edgar Hoover was a homosexual, which was received as very shocking news at the time.
He didn't think much of FDR.
He thought FDR, it's funny, he writes with the Foreign Service, with any professional diplomat's distaste for FDR's back-channeling, manipulations, tendency to send private envoys, some of whom weren't very well qualified, like General Patrick Hurley to China to represent him. And he, in the good sense, he's the professional bureaucrat who says, just leave this to us, we have it, you know, and don't meddle with all this power politics.
And if he despises anybody in the book, it's Hurley, this Oklahoma oil man. None of us have ever seen somebody just get appointed to a diplomatic job because they happen to be a significant contributor and maybe had a little oil money. But it actually looked like Hurley. I think it was a great line that was it you quoted in this, or was it in the afterward? That Patrick Hurley was described as a man where trouble moved with him like a cloud of flies around a steer.
Yes, that's in the epilogue by Bruce. And it's
What
something
did
that,
Hurley do to deserve Davies?
well, he was just a completely bumptious person who knew nothing but didn't let that get in the way of what he was doing. He referred to Madame Chiang Kai-shek as Madame Shek, for example. And he loved to give Indian, American Indian war whoops as a sign of greeting. So apparently when he landed in China, he did this as a kind of sign of conviviality, and it was met with, complete puzzled looks about what's this person doing. He did not trust the Foreign Service officers because they were telling him the unwelcome news that the communists were, succeeding. And of course, it must be said that the reason that General Stilwell, who was the commander of the China-Burma-India Theater for the United States and the Allied forces, the reason they were concerned about working with the communists is because they wanted the communists to fight the Japanese, which they were, doing much more than Chiang Kai-shek was, or prepared to do. So there was a geopolitical rationale for working with the communists. So Hurley sent Davies and other Foreign Service officers back and tried to deal with the communists themselves, and sort of wanted to get them to agree to the writ of habeas corpus and the principles of the Gettysburg Address and the preamble to the Declaration of Independence and the peroration of the second inaugural. He was an impossible task, and of course it came to naught. And then he later resigned in a big huff and blamed Davies and the other Foreign Service officers, some cases by name, for undermining American efforts and undermining Chiang Kai-shek, when in fact, if the nationalists had been able or willing to mount an effective fighting effort, General Stilwell and John Paton Davies would have liked nothing better than to work with them. They had no animus against them. It's just they saw realistically their shortcomings.
For all that McCarthy said about him, he was no pacifist. He was no apologist. There's a moment in the 50s where he calls for a preemptive confrontation. He doesn't quite say a preemptive strike, but a preemptive confrontation with the Soviet Union. I was reading this just as we were going through the we will not contain Iran, we will stop them from getting a weapon moment. Tell us a little bit about why it was that somebody with a view like that ended up on the wrong side of McCarthy.
Well, the tempting answer is that he was smart. And you know, we've never really, we have a big strain in American life that we don't trust the smart guy. I think I felt I knew how the 2000 election would come out when I was driving down Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles and I saw a bumper sticker that said, "My son beat up your honor student." And I think that there's definitely some tendency not to like the bright. But he was extremely hard-headed. He was very practical. He was in, I think it's fair to say, Tiki and Mr. Davies, you'd know better, but I think in his personal demeanor and his rectitude, he was probably a quite conservative, traditional sort of person. And he was reared by missionary parents in China, had a peripatetic education, but a very, you know, traditional kind of life. And what happened was he became this victim of 9 successive internal security reviews, none of which could find that he was a security risk. But the 9th one said that he lacked discretion, reliability, something on a quality of personality that he just would, which of course is exactly what, he had all those qualities in spades. And Secretary Dulles, informing him of this judgment, undermined the whole thing by saying, if you ever need a character reference for a next job, I'm here for you in a moment's notice, you know. So he just was a sacrificial lamb.
And Dulles completely rolled over to this.
Yes, I mean, in fairness to Dulles, I mean, who I don't think deserves that much fairness in this case, he did wait a long time. I mean, he withstood, you know, he didn't do it the first time. And this began in the, this problem began in the Truman administration. It began after 1950 when McCarthy was in Wheeling and waived the speech. But the other thing that, you know, happened was, even for the very longest time afterward, the government was not willing to apologize or to clear him. And he had insisted on being fired and risking, you know, not having a pension and risking future employment because he didn't want to quietly resign and implicitly acknowledge that there was something wrong. And finally, I was reading actually the other day the memoirs of Nick Katzenback, who was the Deputy Secretary of State at the end of the Johnson administration. And he said that the one truly satisfying thing he'd been able to accomplish in the State Department was the restoration of John Davies' security clearance. And it was to do a nominal work on a contract. But the way it was seen that if his security clearance were restored, then he'd be deemed trustworthy. And actually, our colleague John Finney at the New York Times wrote a major story about that. So it was a long, long trip.
Great. Well, Mike, I'm tempted to ask you how a Secretary of State who fires somebody who stands up on principle ends up getting an airport named after him. But I won't. I'm going to ask you about, to take us back here to this remarkable moment in China's own history and its own dealings with the United States, because after Davies got this right, we of course went into a 30-year complete hiatus. And so you've been writing a little bit about this period in Chinese relations with the U.S. What was it that Davies was walking into?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And David, I want to thank you for consistently reminding my bosses at the White House that we were good friends, which, given the New York Times and the Bush-White House relationship, was a real career-enhancing gesture on your
Anything
part.
I could do, Mike. Anytime I thought they were at risk of promoting you, I would remind them of
You were very effective.
drinking in Tokyo or
Exactly.
something. Yes.
It's a family show, so we'll leave it at that. So I was in the NSC staff in charge of Asia policy, and I was there almost 5 years. And I came out of it, having been an academic beforehand, wanting to teach and learn more about the evolution of our strategic thinking in this country about China, Japan, and Asia. And I found there was actually very little that did that. So I started writing the book, and I just finished the chapter on World War II when I was asked to look at this manuscript. And it is beautifully written. You don't have to be a historian or a scholar to just go right through it. It's beautifully written and humorous. But as a scholar, it was a treasure trove of observations. And I looked at, and for this book so far, I've looked at the memoirs and observations of various figures who've shaped our Asia policy since John Leonard, who was on Captain Cook's expedition and then jumped ship during the American Revolution and advised Thomas Jefferson and others. And every 30, 40, 60 years or so, you find someone who is in the front lines of diplomacy, but at the same time has this incredible ability to look over the horizon and think strategically, which he does, and he can prove it because he has all his memoirs and his letters and his books. So he's not just rewriting history. He has all the evidence, which he presents modestly but convincingly that he saw the problems with the Kuomintang and Chiang Kai-shek. But as I was reading it, I was also thinking about the larger problem we've had throughout our history, striking the right balance in how we approach the Western Pacific. We are a maritime power in that region. We have pursued something like the offshore balancing policies Britain pursued vis-a-vis continental Europe, but with a much greater distance. And that has put stress on us and tensions in our approach. Should we be basing our strategy on Japan, or should we be focusing more on getting things right with China, a maritime approach or continental approach? And throughout the history leading up to his time in government service, we had a great deal of trouble getting this right. So in the 1850s, as Commodore Perry, who was commander of the Asiatic Squadron, is preparing to open Japan, our commissioner, our ambassador in China, says, I want to use your fleet to go up the Pearl Delta to negotiate with the Chinese. And he borrows a ship, and Commodore Perry finds out, strands the American ambassador on the banks of the river, and takes the fleet off to Edo Bay to open up Japan. Because from the Navy's perspective, we're a maritime power, it's Japan that matters. It's also, you know, the beginning of a long and wonderful relationship between the military and the State Department. You see this again and again. So he was born in the last year of Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, Alfred Thayer Mahan, and others said, China, and especially Manchuria, is a hornet's nest. We do not want to be in that. Roosevelt was famously pro-Japanese, basically, or inclined more towards that angle. His successor, Taft, very anti-Japanese. And many of the State Department officials who were John Davies' mentors came of age in the Taft period. So he was coming into this at a time when we really kind of swung back and forth between Japan and China, didn't know how much we were willing to put on the table in terms of internal developments in China. Far away, frankly, limited interests. And what's striking about the book is he's crystal clear about all of it. He's not, as you said, he would very happily have supported the Kuomintang and Chiang Kai-shek if he'd been willing to fight the Japanese. I think there were reasons why Chiang Kai-shek couldn't do that, which we could get into if you like, but he was quite clear-headed about that. He actually advocated, when he went to Moscow, cutting off unconditional Lend-Lease assistance for the Russians because he didn't think we needed them. And that we were so desperate to have them invade Manchuria and prevent us from having to send 10 Marine and Army divisions into a horrible land war in China. We were so desperate to get the Soviets in, he said, look, they're going to attack anyway. And we should not be giving them unconditional Lend-Lease. We should be demanding things for it. And he was quite prescient about the problem we'd have with the Soviets in the Far East. So he was he had a sort of flash of real strategic insight. Why did we go back into this flipping back and forth after the war? Part of the reason was because people like John Davies and John Service and others who understood this were purged. And so we didn't have people in the Foreign Service or the intelligence community who were either, you know, trained enough or brave enough to recognize the Sino-Soviet split and to see some of the strategic opportunities that we really didn't take until, you know, 69, 70, 71. So it's a little tragic to read, but it's also very exciting. It's what it was to be a diplomat when there weren't that many rules. And we didn't have, for example, an India strategy until he went to talk to Nehru. As basically, I think, a first secretary equivalent. I mean, he was pretty junior in the Foreign Service.
Wasn't there, there's a wonderful thing where he goes to the State Department and looks for the India file, and there's an old National Geographic map and a
We had always thought of India and the subcontinent as part of the British space. We didn't have a strategy for that region, and suddenly in World War II we did. Well, no, we didn't. We had to. And he basically, as I think what today would be the equivalent of a first secretary in an embassy, met with Nehru and started creating our strategy for that entire subcontinent. So it's really quite fascinating.
It also
period.
just reminded me as I was reading this too, it was much better life being a diplomat before the invention of the BlackBerry. I mean, you know.
newspaper correspondent too.
Yes.
Except for the crashing in the jungle with a bunch of headhunters.
The headhunters thing you could have lived without. Although, as they march out, this is again the British who are dropping in food. The food that they're airdropping for them as they're doing the 12-day march out keeps getting better and better. And in the last weekend, they get ice cream dropped. They know how to live. But the concept of the micromanagement of foreign policy from Washington that you see happen today, you simply, first of all, I couldn't find India on a map because they only had a National Geographic map. But secondly, you just didn't get that degree of micromanagement.
Well, I mean, Davies in the book is very critical of FDR. And I think most historians, there are a few who still hold out and lionize FDR, but most historians, especially diplomatic historians, acknowledge that FDR's long-term foreign policy planning process was a mess. It was an absolute mess. And he's very clear about that. On the other hand, the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, had this view that the State Department managed relations, did not do strategic planning, did not do military planning. I mean, Hull was a free trader. He was sort of farsighted in some ways, but he had a very 19th century kind of patrician view of what diplomats do. Whereas the Pentagon, which was now fighting wars and dealing with allies and logistics around the world, needed some basic policies for how we deal with these countries, and began creating their own foreign policy process, in part because Roosevelt wouldn't and because the State Department wouldn't. So he doesn't talk so much about Cordell Hull, but part of this was the State Department itself was not, he worked with Stilwell. There were some who were, but at the top, for most of this period, Cordell Hull had the view that we don't do strategic planning, we don't do military planning, we don't do manage alliance relationships. And the Pentagon, George Marshall, filled that gap, which really put the State Department at a disadvantage for, I think, years to come. I think we're still feeling the consequences.
Well, Steve, as you look at this, there's nobody who writes more artfully about the madness of modern Washington than you do. So, you wake up this morning and you read Olympia Snow on the question of why it is that the Senate doesn't do what it's supposed to do, and you think to yourself, oh, for the good old days. Mm-hmm. Then you pick this up and you realize the good old days weren't really so hot. So think a little bit for us about the McCarthy era. What actual permanent change in the political culture it led to, and what strains you either see or don't see in modern American politics?
It's a very interesting question, and first, thank you. I should also mention, you mentioned Dulles Airport, just came in from Dulles Airport, and I have an ear that hasn't popped yet. And I'm also irritated whenever Greg Craig's in the audience, because he knows so much about these subjects, and it's great to see Greg, but thank you. One thing I think is important when I was reading this book and thinking about the time and the various battles that we see unfold in Washington and how this place works. McCarthyism is sort of lurking all the time here. It's never really gone away. There is and I just want to say that it is latent, it lurks, it's not, Washington is fundamentally a schizophrenic place with lots of personalities and attitudes and posturing that try to struggle to become the dominant rather than the subordinate personalities. And what happened during the McCarthy period was you had a shift. But I think it's a mistake to think that the kind of forces that came together to demonize, to warp, to pervert the political system for the political ends of someone is something that could happen tomorrow in this town, and I think is always underway. And so what's happened since that time is that other kinds of balances have come together, and I think you've asked a very important question, because what your father did as someone who was not sentimental, who saw the world as it was, who reported on as it was. There are a lot of people in this town like that, but this is also a town of agendas, of those who have missions that they want to pursue, or it's also a town that's full of risk-averse players. And so McCarthyism was both someone with an agenda who began imposing costs on those who saw the world differently. And when you look at Iran today, you look at Israel-Palestine issues, you look at Cuba, you look at Asia. Mike and I were both, and you, we all came out of the Japan days. Had Japan been the juggernaut economy that we all wondered whether it might be someday, you might have had a very serious civil war in this town with high costs placed on people who failed to understand the rise of Japanese power in the world early enough. And I think today, if you stand up and you begin sort of identifying trends, let's take Iran, or what President Obama identified when he ran for office 3.5 years ago, and I assume Greg had some stuff to do with this, essentially about engaging those with whom we have rivalries and problems. Now, why do that? Is it that President Obama wants to go hang out with the global thugs? It's because the world doubts America's ability to achieve the things it says it was going to do, and Obama was looking for a way to change global gravity, to change the way the rest of the world looked at us. But it's a very, very high risk proposal. And today, and clearly, if you had a Nixon goes to China moment, which probably passed, it would have been Iran, as you know. Those who have outlined a strategy or sort of endorsed an engagement strategy with Iran, Iran hasn't actually helped this process, had pay a very high price in Washington circles. And had that become a more potent or ripe track, I think you could have seen in this town, because of the dynamics of the Israel-U.S. relationship and others, a kind of McCarthy-esque, a light McCarthy-esque application where people's careers were affected very negatively one way or another in today's environment. I think that the invasion of Iraq and the battles inside the Bush administration between various players over that policy and the shifts that occurred, particularly in the second part of the Bush administration, also reflected the battles between very key policymakers that began to take on a personal flavor, began to make the town much more toxic, and those that were in one tribe or another, very much along the lines of what happened during the McCarthyist period, happened during that battle. If you stood up and tried to make a realist explanation for why the invasion of Iraq might lead to the empowerment of Iran, you paid a high penalty here in this town. And let me just finish one other element to this. I think that the other part of this, which is so interesting about the time in which he lived, and particularly the transition from Truman to Eisenhower, is that Eisenhower and many of his team that were, I saw as sort of sensible strategists, but the John Foster Dulleses, the Curtis LeMays, and others that came in and detested Kennan, and they detested many who came out of the sort of realist national security camp. Eisenhower, at that time, knew he had a problem because those he had come into office with and his closest advisors hated and detested the policy that Eisenhower personally thought was working. And so they created this solarium exercise, which was to divide the advisors and people in different camps, 3 camps in this case, those who wanted to just get to it and bomb the Soviet Union yesterday, those that wanted to draw a line and destroy them once they crossed the line, and then to modify some form of containment. And over a 5-week period, they had to do a systematic review of the consequences of these strategies over and how it would impact U.S. interests over a long period of time. This was all classified. The material was presented to Eisenhower presiding over 80 national security officials, and you had a contest of ideas about how to shape the world, the international system, and you essentially, all of these officials saw Eisenhower inculcate his national security team with what he thought was the right strategy. We don't do that today. And so what I think was interesting is after McCarthyism really took off, this is how Eisenhower knocked some of that back, essentially to try to get back to frankly, an Enlightenment approach, a rationalist approach to thinking about the costs and benefits of foreign policy, and getting these very divergent forces that were at such war with each other and willing to defame the character of each other so dramatically of the people involved. And I think that's missing today. So when you look at the vulnerability that we have in the current political environment to recreate the conditions of McCarthyism, I would say they're much higher than they should be, because we don't have that kind of disciplined, rationalist, leader-led process that takes Americans and the national security establishment through the choices, the hard choices that need to be made. And so you have potential for the hijacking of passions that then become, very hard to stop.
Well, Steve makes a very interesting point that there is always this sort of subtext of McCarthyistic elements to this. But if McCarthy were alive today, he would probably be astounded that the China lobby you read about in this book, which is all a Chiang Kai-shek, Madam Chiang Kai-shek China lobby, is barely heard from these days because there is such a lobby of American businesses and so forth who are so tied up with our investment in a rising China. Could we see this happen in reverse now? Could you ever see a moment where China's rise led to a reaction that we needed to do more containment? certainly a debate that was going on when President Bush first came in. It got killed off immediately by 9/11. But could you see what he witnessed happen in reverse?
You could, and we've had many McCarthy experiences several times since '54 when Dulles called John Davies into his office and after the 9th review fired him. You mentioned we lived through the Japan thing. I was finishing my dissertation. You were doing various things in Japan for the New York Times, and you were at the Japan Society in Southern California. So we were in the front lines of this, and it sounds very quaint now. But
Big deal then.
They were nasty.
Big deal then.
Charges. He's a chrysanthemum clubber. He's a revisionist.
Yeah.
Then all of a sudden the Japanese economy collapsed, and
Everybody forgot
everybody
that.
forgot. Yeah. And now opinion polls about Japan are overwhelmingly positive in the United States. And so we do have phases in this. We had a little bit of this with China during the Clinton administration, when the China Economic and Security Review Commission was set up on the Hill, and there was some similar kinds of ad hominem attacks over who was too close to China, and then it kind of subsided.
Well, on the fundraising and those
Fundraising,
corollary
yeah.
aspects. Yeah.
And it could happen again because when I was in government, in the first part of the 21st century, the business community held together fairly well on China. And so President Bush rejected several trade cases on the environment and on labor, and the entire business community, basically, with a few defectors, the chamber, the NAM, backed him. Now, with the currency issues and other issues, indigenous innovation in China, I think the business community is much more fractured. So it could happen that you have some pushback against people who work on China. However, it's not going to be like McCarthy era because Taiwan's influence in this town has diminished considerably. So
But it's diminished. It's diminished now, but I would say, even though it was 10 years ago, the conditions you're talking about were nearly achieved had 9/11 not occurred because Tom DeLay became Taiwan's biggest promoter and tied together very closely with the American Enterprise Institute. And if you read the Project for New American Century material about a very well-organized, very disciplined group that had an appetite to have deep traction in U.S. foreign policy, about half of that, maybe less than half of their letters had to do with Iraq, Saddam Hussein, and things of that sort. The other was China.
Yeah.
And so the convergence of that movement, what Tom DeLay was doing structurally, a lot of it had to do with money, and Tom DeLay's unique power. It's not just always the passion or the substance of the policy issue. The question is power and the ability to essentially own and run a major franchise that can move the political dial in Washington. And DeLay put enormous amounts of effort into sort of raising the Taiwan game and to try and punish those people inside the Bush administration who were on the wrong side of this issue. So while it didn't reach McCarthyism, the incipient ingredients were there for that.
I was in the administration. I just quickly on that. Yes and no. I mean, first of all, every new administration since Nixon has come in promising to get tough on China. Usually with Republicans, it's supporting Taiwan, and with Democrats, it's usually human rights or trade.
Usually lasts till about noon on January 21st.
It lasts a couple months, a year. Clinton managed to hold on for about a year and a half. In the Bush administration, it was the EP3 incident in April 2001 that really kind of clarified the thinking. I don't think it was as much. 9/11 had an impact on our China policy, to be certain, but I think it was really what every administration goes through, including this one, when sort of theory hits reality in dealing with China.
But I think Steve's point about the latent need for an other and for demons in Washington, and also I have to say, the ongoing failures of the press. We like to think in the press that you could never allow again a person to stand up in Wheeling, West Virginia on a Lincoln Day speech and say a communist in the State Department, and that this demagoguery would not go unchecked today. I'm not quite sure that's really true. I think if a powerful senator or the chairman of a committee or the de facto Speaker of the House got a hobby horse cause, there could be an awful lot of attention and an awful lot of ink
Might be a
spilled.
cable host.
Well, yeah, I mean, but I mean, think about the political headlines that could generate in one day's, seven news cycles of the But the other thing that, you talked about, Mike, is the scars that we underwent because of what happened. When I was at Princeton in the middle of the Iranian hostage crisis, Harding Carter, then the chief State Department spokesman, came to campus, and he talked about how in his senior year, a recruiter from the State Department, from the Foreign Service, came and said, I cannot in good conscience urge you to apply for the Foreign Service because it is terrible, it's all too politicized. Scott McLeod, who was the head of security, had been kicked upstairs to be ambassador to Ireland, but he said this could happen again at any minute and your whole lives could be turned upside down and you could be punished for telling the truth. And so one of the things that David Halberstam brings out very clearly in The Best and the Brightest is how the absence of people like Jack Service and John Paton Davies and John Carter Vinson and all this whole generation of Asia hands, it left a complete vacuum not only in China policy but in all of the Asia policy, Southeast Asia particularly, and also presumably a reluctance to say anything that was unorthodox, to say anything different in the summer of 1964. Then we better retaliate for the Gulf of Tonkin. And I think the one thing that is probably can never be overlearned is to remember that there's always a demon lurking under the bed that can be made into a scapegoat, and I think that we will never lose money by.
Well, we have just a couple minutes, but if there were any questions that were urgent or topics we missed, please raise your hand and we will do our best to grab a gentleman in the corner. The mic coming right around you. Hold on just one second.
Thanks a lot for the presentation. David, thank you as always. Mark McGuire and Sammy Sosa, but without the need for HGH, so I appreciate it. Went to an event the other day and saw Dr. Kissinger, and triangulation just kept coming to mind. I wondered if you guys read in some of the work by Mr. Davies, or even if his daughter could note what his thoughts were about triangulation vis-a-vis India and China. Thanks.
I'm drawing a blank.
I don't, in the book, which I've read, I'm not sure that I saw very much on that. Anybody
Well, by
here?
triangulation, you mean you're
Playing them
referring to
off.
what Nixon did with China.
Strategic balancing.
I mean, what he saw quite clearly was that we had an alliance with Britain, where Britain, as an imperial power, had a different message for Asia than the message we wanted. We were in an ideological war with the Japanese, and until Midway, and even after Midway, people like John Davies and others in the State Department, the OSS, were very worried that the Japanese might win that soft power war by convincing. Each part of Southeast Asia was different, but places like India, Burma, and Indonesia in particular, that they were the liberators, and they were fighting imperialism, and that Asian solidarity was the way to go. Our message was no, self-determination, and so forth. We were both BSing to some extent, but there was also a certain degree of legitimacy and history in both positions, and the British complicated that because they wanted to restore their colonies, and Davies and others joked that the Southeast Asia Command set up by Mountbatten was really the four letters really represented "Save our East Asia colonies," and so he recognized we'd have a problem after the war with how we'd handle decolonization, and he does mention in the book that the Europeanists at the State Department kind of dominated those decisions by bringing France back into Vietnam and letting the British come back, and he saw that very clearly as a problem.
Well, and he's quite candid about the strains for the fighting alliance that this was already causing, and in his discussions with Nehru and others, and how that was almost impossible in the short term to reconcile with the need to.
And of course, his rescuer in the plane crash came from the British occupying power.
And then kept him waiting while he had his evening cocktail.
That's
So,
right.
pointing out the problem.
Which was how you knew that the age of empire was declining. Right here. Hold on a sec, there's a mic coming.
Thank you very much. Raghuveer Goyal, India, Globe and Asia Today. My question is, so many books are now coming because of 40 years of opening of China. Who really gained from this relationship of 40 years? Because now China is rising militarily, and they have increased to $100 billion their defense budget, but U.S. is decreasing their defense budget. So where do we go in the future? Because there is a big threat in the neighborhood of China, like there is a South China Sea, and many small nations are fearing now and now depending on the U.S. So where do we go from here? Thank you.
Yeah, I just very quickly say, I think it's problematic and probably a mistake to look at the tensions that one feels today in the press between a rising China and a sense of a diminishing or eroding American power. I don't think that these are automatically tied or a zero-sum game. I think the United States might have made many other policy choices that had nothing to do with China, might be in a much better position, and China still have risen. So I think it's a mistake just simply to write. And the other thing is, I wrote a piece along last year called on China called China's fragile swagger, and that while China clearly is demonstrating that it has perspectives and wants to change the game a little bit, but it has an incredible inferiority complex, sense of doubt, fear that it's a house of cards that could collapse, and so it just doesn't fit. China's not going to automatically jump out to be the one at the helm of global affairs.
I'd also point out that while we are reducing our defense budget, and they have just announced this week, an 11% increase
Right.
in theirs.
We are
I think
so
if I
large.
have last year's numbers right, the United States defense spending was slightly greater than the next 26 countries together.
But that said,
There's still a little bit of room.
that said, what David just said, and I feel compelled every time I hear something that's, I think David's right on a substantive level, but power in the world is like a stock market. It's based on future expectations. And right now, America's problem is that it looks kind of like General Motors, well-branded, big, sprawling, but underperforming, and China looks like an internet startup. And so that may not be true. Those may be false metaphors to some degree. But power is more mystique. Bombing, using missiles, et cetera. That's not real power. The power is the ability to sculpt the international system, move one's interests forward, and to create, and fundamentally power is much more mystique. And I think right now, the challenge, whether President Obama remains in office or the next president, is how do you rewire the assets that the United States has? How do you sew together a new global social contract so that the U.S. gets the leverage of having been essentially the designer of a blueprint of a new global order and a new global deal? And in that, China simply doesn't have the capacity to do that, in my view today. But it's not something the U.S. is taking. So I would say that, and the question is, has China's rise and the investment helped anyone? Yes, it's created vast opportunities for people. I think it's made the world a better place, raised people out of poverty. I think it's largely succeeded until we undermined our own brand and exported toxic financial products to the rest of the world. We were essentially looked at as not only the winner of the Cold War, but the winner of the ideological war over how to organize an economy. And again, we inflicted our own wound in that case. But to some degree, even with China's so-called version of authoritarian or illiberal capitalism, they are tilting much more in the direction that we've been going than any other model in the world. So, yeah.
The other thing to keep in mind is that the rest of Asia, which 5-10 years ago people worried would kind of bandwagon with China and follow this authoritarian model, is doing the opposite in many ways. They want to get rich off of China, but they want the stability that's always been provided by the U.S. So India, Japan, Australia, almost all of China's neighbors, except the Russians who have their own particular feelings about us right now, almost all of them are pulling the U.S. in more. And so there are these sort of antibodies.
And the Chinese have helped that.
They've helped
every time
enormously,
they've
yeah.
wandered down into the South China
Can I
Sea.
add one small other thing related to John Foster Dulles, because I think it's important. The other thing I neglected to mention, and it comes out of the period that that Davies was living in, is that John Foster Dulles' decision to essentially adopt Japan was a geostrategic decision to embed Japan's economic future deeply into the United States in fear that Japan would rotate back towards a China-centric perspective. And I think it's one of the really interesting divides in foreign policy national security issues is that those that think Japan just got rich by getting prices right, Japan got rich by being embedded deeply in the United States on preferable terms. And that was a strategic choice. And it's an important lesson because if the United States is going to get into sort of a neo-colonial game and adopt Pakistan, adopt Iraq, adopt other governments, it's really interesting that the strategy that Dulles initiated and the team, which was to create very powerful macroeconomic incentives to seduce and dominate another country, we're not doing today. We're spending $120 billion a year in Afghanistan with $14 billion GDP. And you ask yourself, well, why aren't we just creating trade preferences that would be a lot less costly, but would completely change the dynamic of the aspirations and the direction that these people go? So we do a very heavy, clunky, large military footprint way, but that's not what we did after World War II.
So
Yeah.
we're running short on time, so what we're going to do is we're going to ask the two gentlemen here in the middle to both ask their question. We'll just spread that out, and then that'll be the end of it. So the mic's coming to you first, sir, in the front, and then if you hand it to the gentleman behind you.
Comment first with Afghanistan. We have a trade preference versus drugs, and unfortunately, it's an illegal trade preference. And now a question for David. Actually, the panel discussed whether it would be likely that there would be a new rise of McCarthyism. And actually, we did witness this, and I address this to you, during the time of the Cost Committee and the Wen-Ho Lee affair, in the sense that there was a witch hunt. The press did participate vigorously. The New York Times eventually retracted some of the statements that they had made in following the story. So my concern is to what degree, with regards to nuclear matters, McCarthyism with China has not died.
Yeah, good question. I'll turn to it if you just give the mic back there, and we'll.
It's the same question that I asked myself after reading Barbara Tuchman's Stilwell and maybe even Edgar Snow's Red Star over China. What if they were right? What if we should have engaged the communists before? Would we have averted the Korean War? Would we have created an environment where the Great Leap Forward would not have resulted in 20 or 30 million Chinese losing their lives? Would we have maybe averted some of the catastrophes in foreign policy that we found ourselves in Southeast Asia? It's hard to prove a counterfactual, particularly in such a complicated environment as this. But I'm just wondering, what if we could sort of take back to status quo ante at this moment and things did turn out differently? Do you think we could have created a different scenario for what we now, what China endured for 20 or 30 years after that period?
Sounds like the next Stephen King novel, or the next Philip Roth novel. But I think it's a really fascinating question. And when you were talking about Dulles a moment ago, you can never forget that in Geneva in 1954, John Foster Dulles refused to shake Zhou Enlai's hand. He wouldn't even shake his hand, which is why the palpable image of Nixon shaking his hand on the tarmac that day was so powerful. I mean, I think this comes back to the same question, like, should you talk to the person who's giving you the most trouble or not? And I think the rational human answer is you should always talk to the person who's giving you the most trouble. And Bill Clinton is the first person to say that, I mean, in some ways. I mean, that's his whole political strategy. I was in the courtroom in Albuquerque covering the story for the New York Times the day the judge chided the government on the Wen-Ho Lee affair. And I was also in the Oval Office with David. You were there that last interview with Clinton, right? When I made the mistake of asking him in December of 2000, Mr. President, even your closest friends say that your strengths are all bound up in your weaknesses. Do you think we could have had the best of you for the past 8 years without getting the worst of you too? And he said, oh, I don't know. I leave that to others to answer. But, well, I would have liked to have the best of the New York Times without the worst of the New York Times. How about Whitewater? That was Wen-Ho Lee, Chapter 1. And, I mean, in fairness, a lot of mistakes were made. So.
Todd's answered Wen-Ho Lee. That's probably better than I could, but I'll take a shot. You've asked a really interesting question, which is there embedded in China's nuclear strategy something that creates a level of fear, a search for spies, or so everything that was wrapped up in the Wen-Ho Lee case, whether the evidence was good, bad, or indifferent. And I think I've got a lot of problems with how we covered that and what the quality of the evidence was as well. But separate and apart from that, what I find today is that China is almost off the scopes in terms of the nuclear threat issue. It runs through this book that, toward the 50s, when this is really getting bad, everybody knows that China's headed to the bomb. They don't get there until 1964, but you'll remember that in the weeks and months leading up to the Chinese nuclear test, Lyndon Johnson actually debated whether or not the U.S. and the Soviet Union together should do a preemptive strike against the Chinese nuclear site at Lac Nor and try to prevent them from becoming a nuclear power. Something worth
remembering in the modern era.
No
Well,
corollary about that.
No, I'm not drawing any historical analogies. So here we've gone, nearly 50 years, and we've learned to live with the Chinese bomb, and it turns out they've been, by modern standards, pretty responsible nuclear stewards compared to, say, Pakistan and a few others I can name where we've had, bigger nuclear leakage issues. So I think that particular paranoia about China has diminished considerably. What's increased quite dramatically is, of course, the economic concerns about China as a competitor. And the other thing that runs through this book is the whole concept that China could ever have been an economic competitor to the United States was missing from all of the discussions that are in here, of all of the things they feared about China that led to John Paton Davies' ouster ultimately, that had nothing to do with it, which is just tells you how fast it moves. Well, I thank you all. We've kept you over the amount of time, but it's because it's such a fascinating life and it's such a fascinating book. So thank you all for coming.
Thanks, David. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, David. Great.